Manhattan's Chinatown is one of the oldest ethnic enclaves in New York. It is a vibrant community with a bustling economy and offers a wide range of cultural activities. For the last 150 years, Chinatown has evolved from a neighborhood only for the Chinese to a must-see tourist attraction that became a distinctive part of New York City.
The beginning of Chinatown was really the railways. Railways brought Chinese into America. Railway also brought Chinese from the West Coast to New York, mainly because of the violence that was happening in the Western United States. After the railway was built, a lot of anti-Asian sentiments sprung up in the Western states, and I think many of them could not go back to China, so they got on the railway and they settled here in Chinatown, and that's where how we kind of got started here in Chinatown. But we have continued to evolve since then.
Chinatown is one of the oldest. It's, I think, the earliest evidence that we have of Chinese settlement is probably the mid to late 19th century, although Chinese people have been coming to New York from an earlier point in time. I think that what happened with other ethnic enclaves is that they fairly quickly, within a generation or so, moved outside of the cities. So Little Italy, which is right next to Chinatown, Italians very early on moved to Brooklyn. The Lower East Side, Jews also moved to Brooklyn, or they moved to the Bronx. People tended to want to escape their ghettos as quickly as possible. I think the Chinese experience in New York and in the rest of America has been somewhat different. There was, for one thing, the Chinese Exclusion Act, so it was extremely difficult to be Chinese and to be recognized as Chinese in the United States for a very long time. Many people came here despite the Chinese Exclusion Act and naturally wanted to blend in and not be identified as here illegally, and that was easier to do in Chinatown. And so I think among many other reasons, the population of Chinatown continued to grow and be enriched by subsequent generations.
For a long time, Chinatown had defied Manhattan real estate explosion and was able to keep its unique characters and affordability. But in recent years, the neighborhood has gone through changes that showed signs of gentrification.
Over the past few years, the obvious things are some of the high-rises, the hotels, and some of the luxury condos coming up. You do see a change in terms of the type of people that have moved in and out of the area. So in parts of eastern Chinatown, for example, those areas have expanded, and you may see some contraction on, let's say, the Soho end, for example. And some say that now it's kind of moving back down, the gentrification pressure from East Village moving downwards. So it's constantly changing, and I think one thing that people forget sometimes that nothing ever stays the same, and it's really what you think, what are the best elements of a certain neighborhood character you want to keep and preserve. To say that I want to put it in a time capsule and lock it down forever, probably unrealistic.
We released a report called Converting Chinatown towards the end of 2008, and what that report really talked about was how the neighborhood was changing, how Chinatown is really quickly going from a neighborhood where immigrants can afford to live, can afford to pay the rent, can find jobs, to essentially becoming, like another Soho. Rents are always going up. Landlords are harassing tenants to kick them out either one at a time or en masse, and the city is doing really little, very little, to actually change that dynamic. Unfortunately, a lot of times, like the city and city agencies tend to kind of land on the side of developers and business owners as opposed to tenants. So if you walk around, you really see examples of that happening everywhere. There's the really obvious examples where you see these shiny new condo buildings going up, and when you ask how much it costs to buy a unit in these buildings, you'll hear something ridiculous like $800,000 for a 2-bedroom or $1 million plus for a 2-bedroom, right? very few people in the city, let alone working class people, can afford that kind of money to live in the neighborhood. Walking around, you also see a lot of new businesses opening that don't cater to the current community residents, right? Fancy clothing stores, fancy coffee shops, cafes, right? Those are clearly not meant for working class immigrant residents of Chinatown, and that's another really obvious sign, I think, of like a physical sign of how the neighborhood is really changing and the impact of gentrification.
I kind of sense this past couple of years is there is this hipness in Chinatown, and part of it is the food. I think people want the genuineness, which Chinese American we always wanted. I mean, all the time growing up, coming to Chinatown for real Chinese food. I think the non Asian Americans are also discovering that they want that genuine. In fact, just yesterday, a friend emailed and called and asked me where are some of the best dumplings around. So I was able to send her a list of the dumpling places that I and my staff go to. People are looking for that kind of outlet, bars, restaurant, organizations that they want to check out, which maybe they weren't attracted before, or they didn't know about it before. But now I think there is a genuine kind of resurgency that I've seen definitely this past 2 years.
For a long time, people complain that Chinatown is dirty and smelly, and many buildings are dilapidated. So this wave of gentrification might be a good opportunity for it to get a facelift. But the question is, what does gentrification mean to many longtime residents who have low income?
It's important to remember that gentrification in and of itself is not bad, because there are good things that come with it in terms of additional services, resources that are being brought into the community. But the problem with gentrification, especially in communities like Chinatown and Lower East Side, is the displacement that occurs. And it's an involuntary forced displacement of people who have been living here for many years and have been asking for the same services and the same resources that are that begin to pour in only because of gentrification. And so there's a problem with that.
We all welcome to some extent gentrification because it improves living for all of us, whether we're recipients of the bounty of gentrification or not. I mean, the Upper West Side, where the New York Historical Society is located, for example, went through a very difficult period in the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. This neighborhood was not a particularly safe neighborhood, for example. So gentrification, whether people overtly welcomed it or not, it certainly brought safe streets. So I'm not going to argue against gentrification. On the other hand, when a neighborhood is gentrified, it usually eradicates the whatever ethnic flavor that neighborhood had. And of course, in New York, we think of ourselves as a place that has been welcoming to everyone for really since the 17th century, and this institution documents that already under the Dutch in the 17th century, the first people to come here. There was a culture of tolerance. So we celebrate that as New Yorkers, and we like having enclaves in the city that remind us that this has been a city of immigrants and a city that has always welcomed people from elsewhere.
I think that people should define gentrification better. A lot of people think because there is a upscale establishment, that means it's gentrification. Yes and no. In some way, it's an indicator of gentrification. Gentrification, if you take the actual definition of it, is like the gentry class or a wealthier class moving in, right, and replacing and dislocating kind of maybe the original inhabitants that tend to be poorer in the United States. They tend to be people of color. If you want it to be balanced, you say if you want development without all the bad effects of gentrification, then you say I want development, but with as many of the original inhabitants benefiting from the upswing. So that's what a better way to look at gentrification, because some people would say, even if you fix up a park, that's gentrification. I have to disagree with that, because lower income immigrants, we want good parks too. We want nice streets for ourselves. We want good businesses where we can shop. The question is, can I stay here? Can I afford it?
According to statistics, the average market rate rent for a studio in Chinatown is between $1,500 and $2,000. But many longtime residents pay less than $1,000 for a two-bedroom apartment because of rent regulation. Some of them complain that they were harassed by their landlords.
这几年贵族化越来越严重，这里周围高楼大厦起来，很多房东也想把他的房屋装修成漂亮的，可以租到2、3千块，3000多块。现在我们以前住下来的只有几百块，慢慢增长，就是算1000块吧，他是不满意的，他很想赶我们走。他每一个月1号、1、2号，就是这月头的时候几天，他会有一天到 building 来收钱。他有的时候就是故意不敲你的门，不去拿你的钱，然后就说你这个不交房租给他，用这样借口来告住客。
In order to figure out a plan for the future, more than 30 civic groups and community-based organizations in Chinatown banded together and formed an umbrella group called the Chinatown Working Group. It is going through an extensive process to put together a self-initiated plan for the city to approve.
197A plan is your blueprint for Chinatown that should be thought of and crafted by as many public stakeholders as possible. And it'll go to your local community board and the city to be passed. And it's not just a rezoning plan. It includes many other topics that affect the community, such as transportation, schools, small business development, economic development, job retention, housing, and everything under the sun, really.
How does Chinatown survive gentrification and continue to grow? Many agree that balance is the key.
The preservation of Chinatown is very important. I think, especially in this really fast-paced modern society, I think any traditions, any culture that's worth preserving, like our Chinatown community, is definitely worth preserving. But I think the other side of the coin is at what cost. What's so exciting about this Chinatown, New York Chinatown, is we're the largest Chinatown in the United States, and we're, I would argue, the most vibrant Chinatown. New immigrants are still coming in. People use this as a launching ground to go to other parts of the United States or other parts of New York. So preservation is important, always important, but at the same time, growth. What does it mean to be a community, a relevant community? So I think preservation balancing with growth is how I usually look at New York Chinatown.
Well, you do hear a lot of preservationists, right? And even a lot of some people who advocate for affordable housing. They see that happening. For example, you have a Chinatown 6-story walk-up tenement, right? Typical of the neighborhood. You have primarily rent-regulated housing with a low-income, working-class immigrant tenant base. So they see in the short term, a downzoning or restrictive zoning immediately preserves the physical building. It prevents it from being demolished and putting up a 20-story hotel, for example. And that is a short-term fix to that problem of our buildings being torn down one by one, or burning down or falling down, from landlord neglect, and then being replaced with these, glass window skyscrapers, right? But at the same time, you've preserved the building, but you haven't preserved the affordability.
Chinatown is a gateway, essentially, for immigrants. It provides people with an opportunity to work, live. Especially older Chinese people rely on this community in order to survive. They go to certain places for groceries. They go to certain places to get this and that. This is their community. This is the community that they've been relying on for so many years. And suddenly, for a developer to come in and tell people that they don't belong here anymore is wrong.
This is a neighborhood built by immigrants, right? It is what it is today because immigrants have lived here, made a home here, built up the local economy, opened small businesses, but that's rapidly changing. I think at the very basic level, it's a social justice issue. We really believe that people have the right to have a home. People have the right to have a job and be able to sustain themselves and their families, and that's what we're working with hand in hand with community residents to really preserve.
I mean, Manhattan is never, I don't foresee it ever really growing physically anymore. So there are a lot of people who want to live here, and I think that what's happened in Chinatown in terms of the population density has happened in Manhattan. One thing I would say is that in the 1980s, people were beginning to think that, I would say the early 1980s, people were really beginning to think that New York was on the decline. And so there was really no expectation of population growth, and in fact there was population decline. And so the fact that we've been re-energized and repopulated with new immigration, I mean, obviously not just from China, but significantly from China, as well as from other parts of the world, has been hugely positive for the city. I think that why we're vibrant, consequential, and safer is because we have so many great new people here.
Chinatown's future remains to be seen, and it is not an easy task to figure out which direction it is going. But one thing for sure is that whether gentrification is here to stay, Chinatown residents will most likely find a way to survive, just like their predecessors for the last 150 years.